Alright, so this is one that I put off doing for quite some time, really bluntly just because Jacob's Ladder, looking at it from like kind of an analytical perspective, is a pretty daunting task. So I just kind of kept putting it off for a while, but yeah, and so we've pretty much just come to this now, and I'm shooting this on the morning of my birthday, and I just happened to share a birthday with Tim Robbins, so it makes perfect sense. We'll just do it now. So, I think it's pretty clear what these two have in common, especially since when the jacket came out, it was relentlessly compared to Jacob's Ladder, and for good reason. Because obviously Jacob's Ladder kind of inspired a lot of different things after it came out. It took a lot of inspiration going into it, and then it in itself became such an inspiration. Like Silent Hill is apparently like a huge. I'm not really extremely familiar with Silent Hill outside of the two movies, but to my understanding, they took a lot of inspiration from Jacob's Ladder when creating that. And then there's obviously music videos and a lot of rip-off movies and a bunch of other stuff. But obviously, when you look at like the case of like maybe rip-off movies, if you want to call them that, I guess the question is maybe another movie that seems inspired by it won't. The jacket definitely has its own inspirations and source material that it comes from, but as far as like maybe a filmmaker being inspired by another movie, where it's certainly not going to reach the quality of that. Like this is one of those cases where we can just say up front, it's not like the jacket is unequal to Jacob's Ladder, but it does kind of make you want to go into and see like what is it that the jacket was able to do successfully in its own right, while also clearly taking inspiration from elsewhere, clearly. But I think I want to kind of just go into Jacob's Ladder by itself, and like entirely, and then we'll go into the jacket and see where we end up. So, I'm talking about some of the inspirations. Obviously, there's a lot of biblical inspiration, but there's another thing in particular is a French short film called The Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which is really interesting. That short in itself has a very interesting life, because not only did it like heavily inspire this, and it comes from a short story that's dates back to like the late 1800s, but it did win an Oscar for short film. But then there's also the case of it being released through a Twilight Zone as a Twilight Zone episode, just in its entirety. And apparently that was, like, apparently Adrian Lyne said it was one of his favorite movies, and Richard Rubin, the writer, also was heavily inspired by it, and they kind of came to the conclusion, because I guess there was a butting of heads in regards to exactly how a lot of the imagery would be portrayed, but if there's one thing they agreed on, it was that was a really big inspiration. And as far as, like, the biblical sense, and otherwise, there is something that Rubin said that I wasn't going to try to paraphrase, because I want to make sure I get exactly what he was saying right, but this little paragraph on Wikipedia says, the film's title refers to the biblical story of Jacob's Ladder, or the dream of a meeting place between heaven and earth. But then it goes on to say that Rubin perceived the film as a modern interpretation of the liberation through hearing during the intermediate state, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Then Rubin said, the inspiration, in a sense, is my entire spiritual upbringing. Once you have a meditative life, you start to see that the world is really far different than what it appears to be. What appears to be finite is really couched in the infinite, and the infinite imbues everything in our lives. I think that pretty much sets the tone for what he was going for with Jacob's Ladder. But not only that, really there's just, and obviously when we're talking about like dealing with, a potential afterlife or maybe an in-between, this just happened to come out the same year as Ghost, which Rubin also wrote. So he was clearly in that frame of mind. And that's the thing, too, is you look at a horror movie that goes into horror by genre, but I'd say it's pretty, I guess you could say it's arguable that's where it is. But if that's arguable, then it's almost like unable to be categorized entirely. But the idea of dealing with that kind of material through the lens of a horror movie is very interesting, yet feels so incredibly accurate, because it's because I think I've mentioned many times before that the, I think the thing we're most afraid of would be death, obviously. But even 3 decades into life, it's still something that has kept me up at night so regularly throughout my life. Like, I assume that's for most people, but I almost feel consumed by it in certain times. Like, there'll be a whole week where I just have this dread. So movies like Jacob's Ladder that explore this territory are absolutely terrifying. But what's interesting about that also, and makes the movie stand out so much and have such an impact, is the fact that even though it's portraying this sort of passing over as a horror movie, it's probably at the end of its run, like by the time we get to the end of the movie, it is probably one of, if not the most comforting movie about death. Which is amazing. That you can somehow get from point A to point B, and that's the journey that we've taken and where we end up. Um, and as far as, looking at the movie and the way you want to interpret it, I think it's really summed up pretty clearly in one line that Danny Aiello has at some point in the movie when he's talking about all these different things to Jacob, and he just says it's just a matter of how you look at it. And it's like, I think that I almost felt like he was almost breaking the fourth wall, saying that's basically how you would describe the movie. Also, I do think there's more definitive interpretations of Jacob's Ladder than, say, The Jacket, which is one of those movies where you can take in a whole bunch of different directions. But it's pretty, at least for me, I feel like there's a pretty definitive place that Jacob's Ladder lands once it reaches its end. But talking about it being like, it's basically just, if you don't know where it's going, it's really just this visceral dive into the totally unexpected, where like you really do not know what's coming from scene to scene. And I think that's perfectly portrayed in these first two scenes, where we get the opening in Vietnam, where everything goes completely wrong, and that in itself is just so unexpected and horrific, and we have no idea what exactly is happening in that moment for the first time viewer. But then when we cut ahead to the subway station, or inside the subway, then into the subway station, and what I really love about this is that sort of disorientation that it brings in, because we're not like, obviously we're not talking like directly about dreams per se, but doing like having it feel like kind of in that dreamlike way, where you have like that cut in itself will be jarring, but the cut that really gets me is the end of this scene into the next, when when he goes down onto the track and he's trying to find a way out, because there's no exit here. Like, he's trapped in this station, which has this very nightmarish feel to it, and something very like real and grounded in a way. Especially, and it kind of sets that up when he sees like the demon tail on the homeless guy in the subway that just kind of goes barely acknowledged, like you would do in a dream, because in dreams, weird shit is just there and just exists in that world, apparently, that you've created in your sleep. But then the real cut comes in when he's going down the track and he almost gets hit by the subway, and then it's like, we don't see a resolution to this. We don't see how he got out. It just cuts to the skyline, and then he's just home. And it's like, that's obviously, that could be them just not showing things for the sake of time and not showing the mundane, but it's like, the way that was such a nightmarish way to feel trapped, and then we just cut to the next scene and he's just in another place, feels so much like how dreams work, how we just kind of go into the next thing and we don't even, like, it doesn't even register in dream where we were in the last moment. And I feel like that captures that. I don't know if that's what line or room we're going for, but that's the way I take that, and I've always found that really fascinating that they're able to do that. And then talking about the way they ground us in a certain reality before shit gets weird, but in that very effective method, is this relationship with him and Elizabeth Pena. Because what's great and so interesting about the Pena character and what she brings to it is that we can never, like the movie itself, we can never really gauge her from scene to scene. Like, some of the decisions she makes or some of the reactions she has seem so out of the left field, That it's not even, like, there's the whole thing throughout the movie is we're never quite sure what's even real at some points. But like I said, what the great thing the movie does is it grounds you in a certain reality before that happens to give you that feel. Because one can't really capture this without the other being there, tonally. So before we have jarring things like that, we establish this relationship in this way that's. I was trying to figure out exactly how to describe this without sounding weird, for lack of a better word, but the way it uses nudity is a very nice touch, because the way they've clearly been, like, this is a very lived in relationship at this point, and the fact that she just kind of walks around the room topless for a long period of time while they just talk. And it's like, whenever you're watching a movie and you see a couple, especially when sex has been implied, it always seems weird and unnatural the way everybody's trying to cover up despite what apparently just happened. And it immediately puts in your mind, like, this is a movie thing. So to see, like, a couple that's just, like, comfortable in their bodies around each other, and that's just how the scene plays out, just gives it such a reality. That it's, because obviously, especially in horror movies, you just expect the nudity to be gratuitous, which it very often is. So when you can use it like this to actually ground the scene in some sort of reality and not have that moment where it takes you out and say, like, oh, they're doing the movie thing, where for some reason they're terrified to show each other to themselves. But then, yeah, that goes into how once that's established, she'll just say something or do some drastic decision, and it'll be like, we're always constantly questioning exactly who she is, or maybe what she is, or whatever. And this comes into play when she, like the scene where she burns the pictures. Where, of course, she comes off very sympathetic when she says, I don't like things that make you cry. But then it seems very drastic that she just straight up burns the pictures. But the way I kind of took that also, and this could just be me reaching again, but if we're talking about the fact that he's obviously in the process of going from life to death, um, one of the many things that absolutely terrifies me about the concept of death is pretty much everything that we do in life is we're basically building our brains. Like all the memories, all the stuff we learn, all the stuff we know how to do or whatever, and everything we know about ourselves, everything is like in the brain. And it's like, to think that when we die, that's just all gone, like our brains just deteriorate, is one of the scariest aspects of it. That's like the moment when you actually die, when everything you've ever known is just gone, and stuff that was like just yours that not anybody else knows. All of that was in the brain also, and all of that is just gone. So I almost took that as we're actually watching his memories just dissolve when she burns the pictures. Like, everything he's known were in those pictures, and everything from this life that he had is just going up in flames now, and turning to ash. So that's terrifying and depressing. But that's the power of the movie, is it needs to be terrifying and depressing so that it can reach the moment that it's going towards. But still sticking with it as far as it being like a horror movie, and we get all this crazy ass imagery, and there's obviously going to be scenes that just really, really stick with you. Like the first time, obviously this is a movie that needs multiple viewings, but the first time I saw it forever ago, there wasn't really, I was really young, so there wasn't much I took away from it. It was like way over my head. But even in cases like that, there will be scenes that just stick with you forever. And this movie has many, and one of which, the first one I guess you could say, is this party scene, this dance scene, where whatever could possibly be going on here, and then like the demon imagery starts to come up. We see the sort of head effect for the first time, which a lot of people are really surprised to learn is not even like a post-production thing. It's like, it's more of a thing of that the actors are actually doing that, but it's just a frame rate thing that makes it look like that. But then when we get this moment when it's in another movie, the strobe effect is typically extremely obnoxious, and serves no real effect apart from the director seeming like he's desperate to get the audience to feel something. But the way the strobe effect is used to great effect here is that it's so what's happening and what we're seeing is so outlandish. Like whether it be the birds or the head that he saw in the refrigerator, that seems to be like attacking. And then there's the whole thing of the what's going on with her on the dance floor. And it's the thing is like, but the way this strobe effect is happening, it leaves you to this thing of, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? And the fact that you're, unless you play through it in slow motion, you're never quite sure of that. And that sort of disorienting thing is great also. And another thing that's great, that I was actually reading about that I hadn't even caught on to was the fact that Jacob and his visions are never in the same shot, apparently. And that sort of gives you that, we're like, every like that shot where we see like the what seems to be the head in the refrigerator. It's like the way the shot is done, we're not even sure like where he's seeing it, where it's coming from. It's just there. And I really love that effect, and it also kind of gives that vibe of, is something really there or is it not, which obviously all this is a moot point when we realize where we're headed, but just in the moment, and the fact that you can know where it goes and know that this is a moot point but still want to look at it in as much detail as possible says how well executed this whole thing is. Because once you know the outcome, you could just see this as just one full thing and say like, oh yeah, it's all this, the end, but it leaves you wanting to come back and looking more and more at all those individual scenes regardless of what you already know. And that scene sums that up pretty nicely. And then there's also another way to kind of look at one side and the other is this moment that's really is really confounding to the audience on a first run is when he wakes up after his fever, and we realize that we're in another time period when he's with his wife and Macaulay Culkin's still alive and all this, and it's like, but and your mind goes like, oh, okay, so we're getting a flashback, easy enough, and then he starts to describe what all we've just seen as a dream he was having, but it's like, he says he was having a dream that he was with Jesse from the post office, but it's like, is he talking about everything we just saw, or was this an actual moment in time where he just happened to have a dream about her, not knowing that his future would be with her? It's the air quotes here are just going to be we're just going to know that it's just a predetermined thing. But what I really like about that is how happy he seems in this moment where he's with his wife and, all of his kids are still here, and he puts Macaulay Culkin back to bed and his kid complains about his allowance and stuff like that. And this was like, basically, this was the best place he could possibly be. And then when you look at his relationship with Elizabeth Pena, and it's those moments where we're not quite sure how to gauge her, and the sides of the story with her are where like all the demon imagery comes from and where all the nightmarish qualities are. So it's in the way we see him like come in and out of both of those things. It's almost like it's a representation of, you have the nightmares that you can't wait to wake up from, where like there's just such a relief to wake up from that and know that it was just a dream. And then there's the other side where you have those dreams where the last thing you want to do is wake up. Like waking up is like the worst thing. Like it ruins your fucking day when you have a dream so good and you wake up from it. It almost feels like it's that's the kind of thing we're dealing with here in regards to the scenes with his wife versus the scenes with his girlfriend. Once again, this is all just how I have no idea what's intended and what isn't. But like I was talking about with that Daniel Aiello line at the beginning, it's just what you make of it at the end of the day, as all movies are. Regardless of anything that seems definitive, and obviously, Ruben and Line can comment on this and say, well, I intended this and that. But at the end of the day, you're still going to see and feel just whatever it happens to bring out of you. And yeah, talking about this imagery also, there is, we were talking about the frame rate thing, but there's also just the imagery in general of some of the inspirations, like, I guess Line used a lot of, like, artists and photographers and stuff like that. Joel Peter Wiccan is, if you just Google him, so much nightmare fuel comes up. And one of which, like the legless guy that he sees, I think in the hospital scene, is like a direct reference to stuff like that. And then there's inspiration from Francis Bacon, which is very interesting because not only was there Francis Bacon inspiration in Jacob's Ladder, but the director of The Jacket actually made a movie centered on Francis Bacon called Love is the Devil, and it's which also had Daniel Craig in it. So that's a clear connection here, where you can kind of see the inspirations are kind of coming a bit to a head also. Um, but going forward, also now that we've dealt with, like, the death stuff and the dream stuff, there's some more grounded in reality stuff, where it's the whole segment of the different things we're dealing with here. The testing drugs on soldiers, particularly in Vietnam, being such a key point here, and it is, and it's interesting the way they kind of play with that throughout it. Like when you look at the subway station scene at the beginning, there's just like drug ads everywhere, like it's in his subconscious. Like there's the one at the top that has like the drug hotline on it, and then there's the one that just like says ecstasy and all that. And you kind of get, once you know that, you kind of get it in a sense that just how inside of his mind that we are, and the way it deals with not just that kind of stuff, but like the subconscious also. Um, but on top of that, also this is the point when it kind of, when we're talking about the reality of, or as close to reality as we're gonna get, where it turns into like a classic paranoia thriller, where like the somebody knows too much movie, like the Parallax View or something like that, or the China Syndrome, and it really takes on that kind of vibe also, without losing consistency. Like it's so insane how many different tones this movie juggles, and how many different kinds of movie that it is. But yet they're all kind of telling the same story in this way, because it's interesting how seamlessly they go into each other, because you can see a real transition here, from it being like a paranoia movie to the hospital scene, where it's obviously he's in hospital a lot, but you know what I mean when I say the hospital scene. So when we start off, he has this confrontation with Jason Alexander, when he's saying, Jason Alexander's starting to say stuff, that's like really throwing our minds through a loop about what's real and what isn't. Is Jacob insane? Are the other guys insane? Why did Prue Taylor Vince blow up? Why did his previous doctor blow up? There's something. Why did the receptionist look the way that she did? All these questions, but then it just kind of starts to fall naturally into the surreal, and then the surreal falls into the straight up nightmarish. Because after he's had his argument with Jason Alexander, he goes outside, where he's just snatched in broad daylight in front of a witness. And there's just something about that that just feels like so nightmarish, where like even though you feel like you're grounded in reality, you somehow cannot be helped. Like you're just in this completely helpless situation. And then that goes right into him jumping out of the car and rolling up to that Santa. And just this image of this Santa that's supposedly helping people and is charitable, there's that very creepy moment where we're kind of looking through Jacob's point of view, and the Santa just walks up and looks down at him, and at this point we have no idea what to expect at this point. Like, what is the Santa gonna turn into? What is he? He just takes his wallet. But it's still such a surreal moment that it feels like there's hardly a transition at all, that this goes right into the hospital scene, where we start off and it seems like a normal hospital, and then we just go down further and further and further until we get to the imagery and Gabe's bike and the limbs on the ground and the deformed people everywhere. And it literally, like, you hear about, movies or stories where we seem to descend into a nightmare, and it's like Jacob's Ladder gives us the imagery of literally descending layer by layer into a nightmare until we're at the most horrific spot. And it's like the fact that scenes that seem so grounded in reality were such a clear gateway to this moment is there's hardly movies that can give you a feeling like this where it's like you can tell movies that try and it's usually you can only find it in like books, but the way they were actually able to pull this off visually, it's very clear how this was such a like when people want to do this kind of imagery that it basically turns into they're just doing Jacob's Ladder basically. And it kind of set this standard for that kind of thing. And of course you kind of got the whole sort of, I don't know that I call it a good versus evil thing, but the contrast of like angels and demons, where we have the very blatant moment at the beginning, when he tells Daniel that he looks like an angel with the light behind him and he's wearing white and all that. But when he actually starts to take on that role, like once he's in the hospital, it's like he needs a guardian angel to bring him out of it. And sure enough, we have Daniel busting through the door, demanding to see him. But it's like at this point, we also don't know where quite we are, because this was also apparently in the his wife and kids portion. But yeah, this is the point in time where it starts to kind of fall into place of where exactly we're going. So there's that. And as far as like, and I think that's the thing too, is the Daniel Aiello stuff kind of brings me back to talking about the fact that him and Jacob and his visions are never in the same shot together. And it's like there are plenty of shots of Jacob and Daniel Aiello in the same shot. So it's like that almost makes me wonder if it's like he, even though he's kind of going through hell to get to death, is it's like the fact that he actually is he's often in the same shot with Daniel Aiello and he's never in the same shot with his visions and demons or whatever, as if it's like, if it's kind of somewhat saying he's closer to heaven. But once again, that's just me reaching at everything that's here. There's so much to grab. It gives you so many options and things to run with for yourself, that it almost seems, it would seem too limiting to just say throughout. I mean, obviously we come to a pretty definitive conclusion, but everything in between feels like it's up for grabs. So I'm sure there's plenty of like comments around where people will say, no, it's not this, or no, it's not that. But the people who would say that stuff aren't even listening to me literally saying this right now. So they're just thinking, no, everything's wrong and this is the one right thing. I really don't think, for the most part, it's that kind of movie at all. Particularly in the whole middle portion. But yeah, so and then of course we get to our conclusion and we get to the final moment where he and Gabe ascend the stairs and then he is still in Vietnam and has finally passed over for good. And the thing here is, what's so interesting about the idea of taking, when I talked about this being such a comforting movie about death, despite being a very scary horror movie with frightening images, is it's like there's almost a sort of, like, I think what makes it so comforting is it's almost honest about itself, because you can see there's a number of movies about death that are like really cheerful, like comedies about the afterlife and stuff like that. But in those movies, you know, give me comfort, like Defending Your Life and Heart and Souls and The Green Pastures and Cabin in the Sky and stuff like that are movies that I always found really comforting when I'm dealing with like the death dread or whatever. But it feels like this movie has a certain honesty about it. That it comes with all that horror and it scares the holy shit out of you and then comforts you with the final stages of death. So it's such a wild and visceral experience, but also like an extremely emotional experience. Like it's one of those cases where whenever you show the movie to people and you say like, oh, this is, you know, this really wicked horror movie and there's a lot of freaky imagery in it, and you don't tell them, they just have to find out for themselves that it's actually emotionally devastating too at the end of it, to the point that you almost forget the horror of it because the ending just feels so, like, I don't know, satisfying, I guess, for lack of a better word. But there was even a point, I believe it was Ebert, said that he had a conversation once with a reverend, and a reverend told him that this was one of the most spiritual movies of all time. So I think that says a lot also. So that's probably the best I can do in regards to putting an analytical perspective, my own, on Jacob's Ladder. But yeah, like I said, it's just such a daunting task to talk about it in as much detail as you can. But that's pretty much where I land with that. Like I said, I did. It's one of those movies that you absolutely have to see more than once, and probably when you're of a certain age that you can take it in a little more. Like I said, the only thing that really stuck with me when I saw it when I was younger was just some of the imagery, like the dance scene and the hospital scene and stuff like that. But it's crazy how much is dealt with in this. And then at the end of the day, the final text takes us back to the whole the soldiers in Vietnam getting tested. Is how this whole it's like everything kind of there's nothing it goes into so much but doesn't abandon anything, because when movies like this like tend to try to go after so many things, it's like they give up on one thing and just kind of go for the other, usually the easier route. But this one doesn't, like, it grabs so much and sticks with everything and manages to tell one story and then have this almost transcendent experience by the end of it, which is amazing. So that's pretty much where I land with Jacob's Ladder. So to kind of go over to The Jacket, which yes may seem underwhelming by comparison, because while we did have this, well, you can certainly have, you know, emotional reactions to stuff in The Jacket, particularly when we get to the end. There's it does feel very, because this came out in 2005, I believe, and me and my brother just talked about in our Amityville video that 2005 was kind of this area where horror movies were not in a great place, most of them. And we're getting a lot of forgettable stuff, and there was a lot of stuff. This was also a time where, like, everything was kind of trying to be a mindfuck movie, where, like, I think Stay with Ryan Gosling was this year also. And so there was kind of a... It was the perfect place for this kind of movie to be, but it also maybe potentially kind of gave its reputation like a not a reputation it entirely deserved. Like, maybe it's a little better than the era that it came out would give you, because at the point in time you're like really fatigued by movies like this, and it all just kind of seems like they're all trying to do the same thing and they're all failing at it. So going back to watch The Jacket now, it does come off a bit more memorable than it did in 2005, thankfully. So when you look at this, it also has a bit of not just an inspiration, but a flat-out source material with, there was a novel by an author named Jack London called, in the UK it's called The Jacket, in the US it was called The Star Rover, which is, it goes into that concept. It was from like 1915, I think. But the thing about that is that the author was actually really close with a guy named Ed Morel, who was a prisoner that, like, went through, he was, like, transferred from prison, I think it was, Folsom to San Quentin, and then he went through, like, a whole bunch of, like, torture and endured it and all that stuff. And one of those methods was this jacket that just basically squeezes you into insanity, quite literally. And so to take that and make this sort of horror thriller out of it, there's not near as much horror in this as there is in Jacob's Ladder, but it's certainly there if you look for it. There's certainly some frightening angles to this, for sure. And it all comes from our performance, because obviously I didn't even really talk much about how amazing Tim Robbins is in Jacob's Ladder, by the way. But yeah, all that stuff, especially the fear and the disorientation, would not have the impact that it does if not for the incredible performance that Tim Robbins brings to it. And even those moments like when he's just in the bathtub after we've had the wife scene, where he just laying there and just in his eyes, it just tells us something so horrifying and exhausting. And on the other side of that, we have Adrian Brody here in The Jacket, who naturally went method, apparently. And I know lately, obviously method acting used to be like this really great and revered thing, like everything from, you know, like stuff that Daniel Day-Lewis does. But over time, it seems to have become a bit of a punchline when you look at people like, Jared Leto, kind of made it easy for people to start joking about it. And so, but I do find it admirable what Brody did here, where he actually insisted on being locked in the drawer himself, even when they weren't filming, just to kind of get him to a certain place. And I guess a lot of the reactions of him inside are actually like real. Um, but it's I know somebody famously said somebody saying, oh God, who the hell was it? I keep wanting to say Olivier said to Dustin Hoffman, "Why don't you just try acting?" Um, and I could definitely see that angle also. But for this kind of part in particular, I do admire the lengths that Brody was willing to go to make it as authentic as possible, especially since we're dealing with a subject matter that was real at some point and possibly still is. Um, and it's in the way we kind of see him as like a broken human being before we even get to those moments, when he's quite literally a broken human being, especially when he's walking around at the beginning and he's kind of got the amnesia, and it's like he's just kind of going from place to place, much like is implied in Jacob's Ladder, when it's like kind of going from that scene to scene, where it's like when we see him with Kelly Lynch and the young Jackie and we have that interaction, there's something sort of surreal about these interactions as well, especially since they seem so isolated and like there's nobody else around. But then when he gets immediately picked up by Brad Renfro, and we go into that whole thing, and then suddenly we, cut to a courtroom, we get vague details of what happened. And it's like there is something also here that's kind of doing the disorienting thing that Jacob's Ladder was doing, but it does feel more like we're jumping around as opposed to the sort of genuinely dreamlike kind of bleeding into one scene the next that Jacob's Ladder was doing. So this almost feels like sort of you can see a director intentionally trying to be disorienting, which, like I said, was pretty popular in the era, and unfortunately still is, mainly in straight-to-video movies. But I can see in a story like this, you can at least see why. Like, a lot of directors do that just to do it, because they have no other methods, or they have no other way to get a reaction out of the audience. So it's like, let's just throw noise and flashing imagery at them. But it's like, with this one, it at least serves a purpose. Because it kind of puts us a bit in our mindset, in the mindset of him about not knowing. Because another example of amnesia and the way it's portrayed, you can go to Memento, and how that movie was able to disorient us in a way using the timeline, the backwards timeline, to put us into Leonard Shelby's mind, where we didn't know where we were when he didn't know where he was. And like I said, I can see if that's what they were going for when they like really jump around like this, but you can also kind of see a director's method there, where it's not near as the director's not near as invisible as Line was in Jacob's Ladder when you're actually watching it. And sure enough, once he's in the facility and he's being treated by Chris Christopherson, then we get into the real kind of sadistic directions this is going. And I think what's interesting about the way Christopherson plays this character, and really the way the character's written, I guess, is how there's clearly something like he's almost like in the early scenes. Christopherson almost comes off like a mad scientist, and it's like it's sort of like Steve Martin in Little Shop of Horrors, just this kind of doctor instead of a dentist. But the thing is it's like in the other scenes, like especially the scenes with Jennifer Jason Leigh, where it's like, and then in the later scenes when we see him older, and it's like there's this kind of fine line where it's like, is he an almost mad scientist? Like, there's clearly a sadism here, regardless, because of the inhumane shit that he's doing. But there's just little peeks into him that give us the vibe of, is there something genuine that he's like? Is there something genuine to his character? He's not just doing it to be evil. He just thinks this is the method, the very drastic method he needs to get the results that he's looking for, in hopes of actually accomplishing something. For treating people. But like I said, the whole sort of like portrayal of him as like this ultimate villain, and the very sort of unremorseful way he does these inhumane things, It's a little muddled, that's a case where I don't know if that would be intended or not. It's just kind of a muddled character in general, because especially since there's such an objective way of looking at it of this is fucking inhumane and this is don't fucking do this to people no matter who they are or what it is you're trying to figure out. There are other means, I would surely hope, but the way he just kind of dismisses it as you can't break what's already broken, I believe is what he says, but then later denies that he said keep him in the drawer all night. So it's like I said, maybe there's an attempt to be disorienting there, but it's more just confounding than anything else, and seems kind of like we're just not quite like I was talking about with Elizabeth Pena and Jacob's Ladder, where it's like we're not really sure where the character's coming from all the time in their decisions. And like I said, I can maybe see if they were going with that with the Doctor here, but it doesn't quite have the same effect. It feels more like it's just being intentionally sort of vague, but not to the sort of intended effect. But we do have some good scenes here, particularly from Daniel Craig, who I keep forgetting is in this. Because the last time I watched it, I hadn't seen it in a long-ass time. Probably close to the time it came out was the last time I'd seen it before the most recent time I watched it. And he has these scenes that have very much... he kind of get... Like, early on, you kind of maybe get Jeffrey Goins vibes, Brad Pitt and 12 Monkeys vibes from him. But then there's also scenes where, like, there's a whole scene when they cause the whole disturbance with Brody trying to get back into the drawer, that almost feels like the director's own version of a scene in Cuckoo's Nest or something. And they work. That might sound like maybe desperate, but it actually pretty much works for the most part. I think it's because Craig actually, like I said, I've said many times before that Daniel Craig has always seemed kind of like a... He's just kind of a blank slate to me, and I think he has hardly no charisma whatsoever. But when he does get these roles, where he can just go into it like this, then it's clear he has something that a lot of his more famous roles are kind of almost keeping him from going, to showing what all he's actually capable of, and all the different directions he can go in. So this is a good example of that as well. And then we have the scenes when he meets Keira Knightley, which takes on a different tone for the most part. And there is something nice here. Like, with that kind of tonal change that would typically be when the movie's kind of slowing down, or it's just the stuff you don't give a shit about. But obviously, the connection between these two characters is such a large part of what the story is, that you do want to see, like, what directions it goes and how they're able to... Like, where exactly they expand on this and where exactly it's going. So when we see her, we're immediately drawn to her by the way she's, like, seemingly begrudgingly charitable. Where she's like, do the math charitable. Where it's the case of, like, it's not like, oh, I saw that you needed help. And it's like, oh, I can help you. It's more like... Well, you could do this, but you can't do that. And so this is pretty much the only option. So you're, like, gonna probably die here if I don't take you, so this is gonna happen. But then, once we see her in her natural habitat, it does kind of turn into this whole thing of... They're just two, like, lost people, the way they have, like, this little impromptu Christmas Eve dinner with each other, and it's like, it says something about her character of... When I say, like, that's why I say in quotes, she begrudgingly takes him in, where it's like, you can tell, as begrudgingly as she tries to make it seem like, she probably did need somebody tonight. And the fact that they come together does make this nice story. It does, I mean, I suppose it gets a little weird, if you look at it from a certain standpoint, that he met her when she was that child on the side of the road. Because I do think... Not just in that sense, but in a general sense. There's just something so nice about this relationship in this scene, the Christmas Eve dinner scene, that when we do start bringing, sex scenes into it, it does kind of cheapen the whole connection between these two characters. I do feel like if it was a more platonic thing throughout, and then maybe implying, like, romanticism in, like, the last scene, like, the last shot, maybe... But apparently I'm not alone. This is a case where usually test audiences tend to be thought of as people that don't always know what's right or wrong for a movie, and apparently the sex scenes in this were significantly longer, but the test audiences didn't like it, so they were cut down. And I think this is a case where I'm kind of on the side of the test audiences. It's like, that's not really anything this movie really needs, and they do the movie thing I was just talking about. The Jacob's Ladder did so well, where it kind of portrayed that so realistically. No, these are very, very movie sex scenes. So any sort of reality in their relationship is not near as apparent as it is between Tim Robbins and Elizabeth Pena in Jacob's Ladder. So there's that. But regardless of all these things, and a lot of maybe negative aspects you can say the movie has, particularly in the direction, there's still just kind of something engrossing about the story. Like, there's something kind of engaging throughout it, almost kind of unexpectedly. Like, the way it jumps around, you would think it'd be one of those movies that you just want to give up on, because after a while, when it seems like a movie's trying too hard to be like a mindfuck movie, it's easy to give up on, because you can just see, like, it just feels like amateur hour when you have movies like Jacob's Ladder that exist. But no, the story itself does, like it is an endless search for questions, like so many of these movies are. But you actually, there's something engaging enough that you do want to find out more. And it's like with each new direction they go in, you're pretty much right there with them. And so I think that comes through actually nicely. And in the way they throw in some disorienting details, like having the kid of Jennifer Jason Leigh's friend be the same kid that played the Iraqi kid that shoots Brody, shoots or kills, depending on which interpretation you take. And then there's little interactions here and there when he's questioning people at work, like when he's like the way he talks to Jennifer Jason Leigh in both the past and present, where he talks to her in the present and then, well, wherever you are in the timeline. He talks to her in 2007 and then goes back to 92 or 93. And the fact that she kind of, he's telling her things that he otherwise would never know. And her reactions to that make for really good scenes. And then there's interactions with, like, the other guy in the facility, Damon, who's played by the guy that plays Bates on Downton Abbey, weirdly enough. That was jarring. And just little interactions like that really make these scenes come to life in a nice way. Mackenzie Phillips as the nurse is here. Yeah, so it keeps you engaged and engrossed throughout it as it's doing these, even though, because movies like Jacob's Ladder exist, we do kind of know the directions that the jacket's going to go. Except for the fact that the jacket does leave more in regards to the interpretation front, where it's like there's like a lot of people have a lot of different interpretations. Where, like, with Jacob's Ladder, you can pretty much say, yeah, the whole movie was him passing over as he was dying in Vietnam. It feels pretty clear, despite all the ways you can interpret what's in the middle before we get to that point. But here, with the ending, to my understanding, there is quite a few interpretations, which, in a way, in another movie, like in a lesser movie, you could see as, like, maybe lazy, like they didn't know what exactly they wanted to do. So they just like, well, here, we'll let the audience decide. But I do think they set it up in a way enough to where it doesn't feel cheap, because there are obviously movies that thrive on, like, that's what keeps those movies alive through time, is that people can discuss them and decide where it goes and debate, if this makes sense or if this interpretation and if it connects to this or that or whatever. So I know one popular one obviously is, it just goes full Jacob's Ladder. Like, he was dead from the get-go, and all of this is the in-between. Which is very easy, because, like I said, just go full Jacob's Ladder if you want to. That's the easy route, I would say. There's also some interpretations I've seen about him, like, he dies in the drawer. We don't know when, but at some point he dies in the drawer, and maybe the final scene is like a sort of heaven, I suppose, when he sees that, Kelly Lynch is still alive and didn't actually burn to death, which means that Keira Knightley actually turned out great and all that, and they're going to have this nice life together and all that after they meet. Then I've heard that the happy ending is the reality, and all the stuff in between was like hallucinations leading up to that point, brought about by the amnesia and the gunshot wound and all that. And I'm sure there's even more, but that's just a few of them. I don't know. I don't know that I'm. I talk about how the story in the middle is engrossing and engaging and all that, but I also don't know that I've ever been invested enough in the movie to fully decide on for myself what it is. Um, but it's because I feel like just going the Jacob's Ladder route is lazy. But I would say, yeah, I mean, I feel like he's clearly dead. But but that's pretty much as far as I get. Like it's when he died, or exactly where. Like if he's still in the drawer, him being dead in the drawer makes sense to me. It's like when they left him in there all night, and it's like he was barely still alive. It's like you just leave him in there one more night, and it's like this could all be, what he's seeing in those moments. And it's like he could still be in the drawer right now. It's hard to say. I feel like that's the direction my mind probably leans towards. But like I said, props to it for having so many different options and not necessarily a definitive one. And like I said, if anything, that's gonna keep it going because to my understanding, even though critics didn't take to it and it was pretty dismissed at the time, I think audiences have taken to it. I don't know if that's over time or what, but yeah, but so there's certainly admirable things here, but I don't think it's even close to the level that it's kind of trying to reach, or a Jacob's Ladder level or whatever. So that's pretty much where I stand here. So yeah. So the next thing is going to be another Stephen King novella thing, and then we're going to go into the Trial of Chicago 7 will be somewhere in here, and me and my brother are doing another video, which will be somewhere in here. These next four are going to kind of all be close together. So, yeah, so I don't believe I missed anything that I wanted to bring up. So I think I'm just going to end this here, so until the next thing, I think that's it.